We may start. Good evening to everyone. My name is Valentina Zasadko, and I am Director of School of Public Management at Ukrainian Catholic University. Dear friends, thank you for joining our event. This meeting is one of the series of events that we call Stand with Ukraine. The purpose of this event is to unite the international community to support Ukraine during the full-scale war waged by the Russian Federation. I have an honor to introduce you our today guest speakers. Michael McFaul served as a United States ambassador to Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014. Michael McFaul is currently the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and Hoover Fellow at Stanford University. Hi, Professor McFaul.
Hey.
Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at Stanford University and a faculty member of Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And the professor has been a friend of the Ukrainian Catholic University for many years. Hi, Professor Francis Fukuyama. And the moderator of today's meeting is Pavlo Sheremeta. Pavlo Sheremeta served as a Minister of Economic Development and Trade in Ukraine in 2014. He is also founding director of our School of Public Management at Ukrainian Catholic University. I wish all of us a fruitful conversation. Pavlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valentina. It's it's good that basically you control the most important part of our conversation, which is introductions. I don't need to do this because I usually mess up with this. So we're done with this. Professors, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for your support of Ukraine at these times. And without further ado, Ambassador McFaul, I would like to start with you, but Professor Fukuyama, I also would like to have your input on that, because it's just the most recent news breaking news the CNN posted basically some 25 minutes ago, as I see. Russian forces are bombing Mariupol Azovstal factory, and that signals the new phase of the war. And Ambassador McFaul, I am quoting your most recent op-ed in the Washington Post, where you say that the free world needs to provide Ukrainians with quality and quantity of weapons to prevail in Donbass. A Ukrainian win or stalemate in that battle will make us and our NATO allies more secure. A loss will produce the opposite. Could you please elaborate for us on this point and the significance of this second phase of the war, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, thank you, Pavlo. It's great to be here again with everybody. Always great to be with Frank. And there's lots of things I would say as a preamble, but I'm going to skip it and just answer your question. First of all, in my reading of the situation, and I sometimes hesitate to use the word war, because sometimes the way that the Russians are fighting doesn't feel or seem like a real war to me. It seems like a criminal activity, genocidal activity. These are not the normal ways of war. So forgive me when I stumble when I say that word, and I forgive me when I can't remember the appropriate adjectives to describe the heinous, horrific, genocidal, criminal, unprovoked military operation, invasion that Mr. Putin has launched against your country. The second thing I want to say, though, is this is not the second phase of the war, in my view. This is already the fourth phase. This is Plan D. So Plan A was to what we call in other wars that the United States have done, shock and awe. Plan A was to bomb a few cities, to scare away, and maybe please mute those that are joining so we can keep hearing. Thank you. Zelensky would run, the Ukrainian forces would capitulate, and the war would be over in 3 days. That was plan A, that failed. Then plan B was to seize the major cities of Ukraine. And there was a major effort to do that. And we all know that that failed as well.
Professor McFaul, please turn on your microphone.
Somebody muted me. I didn't mute myself. That was the controller here. Not democratic, autocratic. But I'm sorry to go on. But plan B was to seize the cities. That failed. I think the battle for Kiev that Ukraine won will be a historic battle that will be written in history books forever. A monumental victory. Plan C, when Mr. Putin failed to seize cities, he then just tried to destroy them into oblivion and wipe them out. That's what's happening in Mariupol right now. They didn't seize Mariupol, right? They're just trying to literally eliminate, depopulate, destroy everything in Mariupol as a way to capture that territory. And I think it's still amazing that Mariupol still has not fallen. So even plan C, that kind of Kherson, that kind of attacking has met big challenges. And then plan D will be to try to consolidate, what the Russians called Novorossiya, the land from Crimea to Donbass. And that seems as to what is in motion today, right now. And what I meant in that piece was just, America has a moral and strategic interest to do whatever we can to help Ukrainians to stop that new phase of the war from succeeding. And I think we're doing a lot. I applaud what we're doing, and I think we need to do more. If you think 18 howitzers are enough to win the war, I don't. For instance, the long-range artillery that we sent, it should be 80, it should be 200, it should be multiples more than what they've provided so far. And so the purpose of my article was to say, good job so far, but please provide more. Because, on the one hand, it's a moral issue about right and wrong, dictator trying to destroy a democracy. And we should, for moral reasons, do everything we can to help Ukraine defend its territorial integrity and independence. But I also think it's our war as well. It's our strategic interests are at stake as well. If Putin, God forbid, prevails in this latest campaign, that will send a signal to all autocrats around the world that that power can be used effectively against democracies. That will make our allies, our democratic allies in Europe, nervous. That'll make our partners in the Middle East nervous. That'll make our partners and allies in Asia nervous. And we'll spend billions and billions of dollars in reassurance for our allies on the front line in Europe. So I think and conversely, if Ukraine wins and defeats Putin, that sends a very powerful signal to other enemies of the United States and our allies and partners around the world. So I think it could not be a greater, our stakes here could not be greater. I think this is the most important war, most certainly going back decades for American national security interests. And that's why I think we should be doing more.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just to clarify, by the way, yeah, I misspoke. Of course, I think CNN mentions the word next phase, not the second phase. But to you, the question to you: are you happy with understanding in Washington D.C., in London, in Brussels, that this war cannot be lost? That this war must be won just, for the purposes of the future development of mankind, or more needs to be done on that? And if yes, more needs to be done, what you're doing for that and what we can do for that?
Well, I don't know of a single politician in any of those three places with the possible exception of Mr. Trump, that doesn't believe what you just said and rhetorically says what you say. I think that's a great achievement, that there has been such unity. But what I see is, and I'll just speak about the United States, which I know the best, but I hear from colleagues in London and Brussels and elsewhere, this debate happens there. There is a tension between two different sets of objectives. And so they're weighing them as they debate this. One tension is about the fear of escalation with Vladimir Putin. He's convinced many leaders that he's crazy, that he'll do crazy things, that he'll use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, against the United States, that he might attack NATO. I believe those are exaggerated threats. I wrote that in the Washington Post article. We can come back to that. But there, you asked me an analytic question. Most certainly people in Washington are worried about that versus what they should give Ukraine. Every now and then, by the way, there is an arrogance, in my view, and a paternalistic attitude from some in the West that think they know what's better for Ukraine than Ukrainians. So, you know, if you remember the debate about the MiG-29s, Poland has 24 of them. From what I understand, the NATO alliance has 70 of them. Some, not all, but some in the Biden administration said, well, you know, Ukrainians don't really need these weapons. There hasn't been a lot of air fights between fighter jets. And, you know, I personally talked to Zelensky during that debate, and he said, we do need them and we want them. So my attitude is, let's let the Ukrainians decide what's best for them and try to help them. But that's a marginal issue. That's not the main one. The main one is this fear of escalation. And that was the argument that was made about the MiGs. And it's hard as an outsider, Pavlo. I worked in the government for 5 years. And so I read lots of secret intelligence. And when I read that the intelligence community has determined that this will be perceived as escalatory, you know, I want more fidelity about that intelligence. What does it mean? He's going to be more angry, or he's going to attack NATO? Those are two different things. Of course, they'll see it as escalatory, but yeah, we don't have a way to evaluate that, right? So that's somewhat frustrating. Then there's a second debate, in addition to the escalation debate, which is about the effect of sanctions on individual national economies and the global economy. And that's a real debate, and we should not trivialize it. That is to say that those of us who argue for more sanctions, and I'm in that camp, I know Frank is in that camp, we will release a paper later today outlining some new ideas on that. But the other camp, the other side of that says, well, if we do that, that's going to lead to inflation, and we can't afford inflation. Mr. Macron, of course, doesn't want it to have that debate until the presidential election is over on Sunday. And here in the United States, there is a real tension within the Democratic Party that fueling inflation before the midterm elections will lead to Democratic Party defeat. And that's not my position, but you asked me to report on it. That is the debate that's happening in Washington.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to turn now to Professor Fukuyama. Professor Fukuyama, Ambassador McFaul just recently said that if Ukraine wins, a month ago you produced this, I would say, wildly optimistic view. It's not if, it's when Ukraine wins. And by the way, thank you for doing that, because you cheered us up tremendously. This piece was shared a lot in both Ukrainian and English. Anyway, given the dynamics of the, well, I would still call it a war during the last month, especially this next phase, do you still stand by this forecast? And if yes, why? And if not, then why?
I think I was right, with regard to the battle in the north around Kyiv. The military challenge in the Donbass and in the south of Ukraine is much more difficult because the terrain is less favorable to Ukraine, and the Russians seem now to have realized that they have to concentrate on, one axis of advance. They now have a single theater commander. But, it does seem to me that the real issue all along has been one of morale, that something like 250,000 Ukrainians returned to Ukraine so that they could fight in this war. And, thousands of Russians are trying to get out of Russia and, avoid conscription. And, the morale does not seem to have changed. The Russians are throwing these units that were defeated near Kyiv into the battle in Donbass, I think way before they're ready. And so I do think that there are still some important weaknesses, but obviously nobody can really predict the outcome. And I agree completely with Mike McFaul about the need to urgently upgrade the type of weapons that are being supplied. It's a little bit hard not being Mike knows the internal debate better than I do, but there are these hesitations having to do with escalation that he mentioned. There are probably some other bureaucratic and kind of implementation issues that the U.S. government sometimes can't really act all that quickly for a lot of reasons. I think I would hope that the administration understands the need to press forward quickly and unblock that. The other issue that I think I would like to raise that I think is extremely important is both a strategic and an economic one, which has to do with Ukraine's export capacity, because as you all know, the Russians are basically blockading the whole of the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, even though they've only occupied the ports around the Sea of Azov. And that is actually one of the factors that's fueling global inflation, because Ukraine, the second largest grain exporter after Russia, and very little is getting out from either country. And so you're facing, a global food crisis in the Middle East and Africa, in many other parts of the world. But I spoke a couple of weeks ago to a large group of Ukrainian businessmen about the problem of being able to export, and obviously the logistical problems are enormous. You cannot substitute rail, for the seaborne transport. And one of the issues that I don't really understand is why NATO and the United States have not been more focused on this issue, of how to unblock Ukrainian exports through the Black Sea. Obviously, the Turks, under the Montreux Convention, have closed the straits to the passage of warships. Their position, I don't think, is necessarily fixed, because they've done things that have been fairly sympathetic to Ukraine. Certainly in international law, protecting the innocent passage of commercial ships in international waters is something that's perfectly legitimate, and it's another task that NATO could consider. And I think after the sinking of the Moskva, the threat posed by the Russian Black Sea fleet has been considerably diminished. And so I would hope that we don't simply focus on the fight in the Donbass. That's obviously critical right now, but I think that we need in the short run to think more strategically about how to open up passage out of Odessa. And then I don't think it's too early to start thinking about the reconstruction of Ukraine, because regardless, I don't think the Russians are going to succeed in anything like their original plans, but regardless of the possible outcomes, that reconstruction task is going to be enormous, and it's something that we really need to be planning for right now.
Thank you, Professor. I will have one more question to you, but since you turned to economics, let me also turn to Ambassador McFaul. Ambassador, you advise Ukrainian President Zelensky regarding the sanctions on Russia. You already covered that topic, but I would like to zoom in more specifically on that. What else needs to be done, and what else will be done to cripple Russian economy even further?
Well, to be clear, we have a international working group of experts. Frank is a member of this group, and we have been meeting for several times motivated by the proposition that there hasn't been enough done on sanctions. Sometimes in the debate here in the United States, most certainly in the public debate, there's this sense that we've sanctioned everybody we can and there's nothing more that we can do. And by the way, we just had a very senior White House official brief our group last week, and he did mention, it was off the record, so I won't mention his name, but he said that by their count, the US government has sanctioned 900 individuals and companies in Russia. So that's a big number, and that's an important number. But when we talk to Ukrainian officials, government officials, they say, again, I was off the record, but one of them said, well, that's nice, but we have a list of 6,000 Russians that we think could be sanctioned, right? And I just think that that captures, I'll get to the specifics in a moment, but I think that every time I go back and forth talking to Washington versus Kiev, just the sense of urgency and the magnitude is always bigger, obviously, for all of you, right? The Americans are very proud of the weapons they've sent, and the Ukrainians are, thank you very much, please give us more. The Americans are very proud of the sanctions they've done, and the Ukrainians are, thank you very much, please do more. And I just think it's worth reflecting that that's very natural that would be that way, given that your country and you are fighting the Russians every day. You're not sitting in those bureaucratic meetings that Frank described, where they're having their interagency policy meetings to decide next steps. And I think that sense of time is just so different in the Ukrainian government versus the American government. And I'm guessing the same would be with European Union and the UK and other places. So I'll just send you the paper. It'll be out probably in the next 2 hours, and you can go through and see it. I think it's rather comprehensive. There's a big section on oil and gas sanctions, and people say it can't be done, and we say no, it can be done. And we outline some ways to do it, some mechanisms there to be thought of, particularly in Brussels. One idea, for instance, is an import tax or a tariff to make Russian oil more expensive. A second is to set up escrow accounts. This is what we did when I was in the government vis-a-vis Iran. And the way that worked was we did not block all Iranian exports, but we didn't allow the return of the money that they paid, except for very specific categories related to humanitarian relief, food, things like that. And that's what we're recommending for Russia. And then we released that money when Iran signed the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, right? So that's another idea. There's a big section on financial sanctions. So the good news is that many major banks have been sanctioned, and by the United States, the Bear Bank and Alpha Bank in particular. But the bad news is that many other banks have not been sanctioned. So it's a very imperfect sanctions regime with respect to financial institutions. So we recommend a complete ban on all Russian banks and complete blocking sanctions on them all. Third, we boldly, but I think correctly, recommend that countries classify Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. And when you do that, that has implications for certain things that they can do and not do in the international system. Fourth, we recommend more individual sanctions, long lists of other people that we think should be sanctioned because of either their direct support for the war or their indirect support for the war, such as propagandists for Putin. And then we talk about secondary sanctions too, as a way to try to pressure those that are not part of the sanctions regime, but to threaten them with secondary sanctions if they continue to import Russian goods. And we talk about not just oil and gas; those are the most important, and oil in particular. Our team came to the conclusion that stopping the export of oil is probably easier to do than stopping the export of gas to Europe. So that's where the focus is. And then the end of it is, this is the first menu, and then we should do more in the future. But Frank might have some more things he'd like to add to that as well.
No, that's pretty comprehensive, Mike. I really support all of the measures that are outlined in that paper, and I hope that the administration and the international community take up some of those ideas.
Thank you, professors. Professor Fukuyama, before we turn to the audience questions, and actually I will relate to one of them, may I suggest that we take a little kind of step up and look at the situation with more perspective, like you do in not even in the most recent, but in the upcoming issue of the Foreign Affairs, which is May-June 2022 issue. In the article, A Country of Their Own, Liberalism Needs a Nation, which you start with the words that liberalism is in peril, and that relates with the question that Natalia Starodub is asking, do you think the Institute of Democracy itself is in a crisis or not? So do you think democracy is in a crisis? Do you think the liberalism is in a crisis? And what is the importance of the war, the Russian war in Ukraine in this regard?
Sure. So yes, I definitely think that liberal democracy at a global level is in crisis. Freedom House reports that the aggregate democracy score of the world as a whole has been declining for 16 straight years. And what's troubling is its decline very substantially in the world's two largest democracies, the United States and India. And we've seen the growth within democracies of these right-wing populist movements. Marine Le Pen, I think, has been revealed in recent days to have said some, just recently, some very positive things about Putin, as has Donald Trump, and it all indicates that they actually see Putin as a model for the way that they would like to govern if they were actually elected. And I think that the liberal idea, has come under attack both from them, but also from parts of the left that thinks that liberalism is too slow, it's too procedural, it hasn't dealt with big problems of social justice that it has promised to achieve, but hasn't. And so, I think that we need to realize that even if Ukraine gets through this crisis, defeats Russia, that you've still got China waiting in the wings, you've got Iran, you've got Syria, you've got Venezuela, you've got a whole series of countries that have gone down this authoritarian route. And, the struggle is not going to be over. Mike and I have argued for a long time that we thought that Ukraine was the frontline battle in this larger war, but it's only one battle, and I think it's something that we'll need to keep struggling over. China is watching what happens in Ukraine very, very closely because it also has irredentist claim on Taiwan, and I think that they are gauging the Western reaction and the nature of the sanctions to Russia as a measure of what might happen to them if they were to move militarily on Taiwan. And so that's an immediate way in which the struggle in your country, affects a much larger global situation. I guess the final thing to say is, as an American, it's been really shocking that we elected Donald Trump in 2016 and that he almost won in 2020, and that we have a significant part of the American electorate that have been convinced that the last election was stolen and that Biden is an illegitimate president. And I think that weakens our foreign policy because we don't have the same kind of consensus that we used to, bipartisan consensus. And I think one of our tasks as Americans is to try to restore that unity of purpose in the United States so that we can actually play the kind of leadership role that we were accustomed to playing for most of the period, since World War II.
Thank you, Professor. Now I open the opportunity for the audience to ask their questions. There are three ways to do it. Either raise your hands, electronically here in Zoom, you can do it. And I can see, okay, there's a hand already, Dmitro C. You please go ahead.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I've been a little bit late, so maybe my question was already answered, but this is the question to Professor McFaul. In your recent tweets, you said that, let me cite it, Russian personalities who use their public profiles to foster support for Putin's war should be sanctioned. And basically, I'm involved, I'm a part of the team in Ukraine here at the National Agency of Corruption Prevention to propose the list of persons that should be sanctioned. And this information is collected by various analysts, data analysts. We find proofs that this person indeed supports Putin or maybe very influential. And here he or she states that Ukraine should not exist. Okay, we have a list, we have like targets, but how should we proceed from here? What is the best way to advocate that? Because so far I haven't seen a lot of such persons sanctioned, except for top-level propaganda spreaders like Solovyov. What should we do? How should we tackle it?
That's a great question, and I don't have a great answer. But I'd say two things. One, as I've mentioned before, we will submit our paper today we're going to start with the White House. We're sending it to Jake Sullivan from the National Security Council and Andriy Yermak, the Chief of Staff for President Zelensky, and then we'll send to other capitals. And then we will publish it as a way where we want to put pressure on governments. We have in our paper one sentence proposing what you're proposing, but you're going into the specifics. And what I would say is we have a website that will go live actually in 24 minutes at Stanford, at FSI, where Frank and I work. And we want to use that website to aggregate new ideas on sanctions. And so you should send us your ideas. You should put it up on I think it's important to think about the technology of circulation, right? So you should put your names up somewhere, and then we should cross-list them on our website. And then people like me and Frank and others should bring attention to that list, because I agree completely that they should be sanctioned. And I just think we need to bring attention to them. And as one Russian oligarch said to me early in this conversation that avoided sanctions, he was very grateful that he was not named in the various sanction things. And he said, even if your name appears on a list that should be sanctioned, that begins to affect your personal lives. And so you have that power even without getting the sanction on there. When you name somebody and you suggest that they should be sanctioned, that also has direct implications for those, especially those that have financial interests abroad. So remember that that power is yours even without getting governments to go along.
Okay, thank you. Sasha Strodubsev corrected me that NACP is engaged in the groups that you are leading. So probably my question was a little bit off target, but again,
That's okay.
I know.
That's right.
I
Dmitry, but we need the names. The names are important. I think it's very important. So we should definitely circulate those, later today.
Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you, Ambassador. I didn't mention two other ways. Chat, of course, you can put your questions into the chat. We all see it. And when you were registering, some of you, about a third of you, wrote some questions. So since I do not see raised hands and I do not see questions in chat, then I will pick up some of the questions from your registration form. The problem is that there are 270 of you who registered, which means it's about 90 questions there. But since we were concentrating much on the war, let me pick up the question from Olga Romaniuk, who is asking how to build Ukraine. She says Ukrainian policy, but let's take a little wider. How to build Ukraine after the war ends? Professor Fukuyama, shall we start with you?
Sure. This is the question of state building is one that I've thought about quite a lot. And, in a certain sense, there's nothing like a war to motivate state building. I think that the first thing that needs to be done is that people need to think big in terms of big institutional changes that are made possible by this, horrific trauma that Ukraine has suffered. So if we assume that the war winds down reasonably successfully, that the Russians are pushed out of a lot of the territories that they gained, and Ukraine is unblocked and able to kind of rejoin the international community, I think that the whole political system in a way needs to be rethought. Before the war, it seemed to me that the biggest obstacle to progress in Ukraine was the dominance of the economy by the oligarchs, all of whom fled the country right at the outset of the war. And as we speak, Akhmetov's steel plant is actually becoming the bastion of resistance in Mariupol. But that also provides an opportunity to rethink an economy based on a different understanding of national interest, in which you simply won't have that kind of domination again. And I think that, the war may create the political conditions under which that would happen. I do think that there's a little bit of a danger that President Zelensky has been, very dominant and very inspiring to everybody in a post-war situation. In a way, you want to make sure that institutional position of president still remains a constitutional one within, limits that are clearly set by the society as a whole. But that prestige and influence can actually be used very constructively to change things about the way that Ukraine has operated in the past in terms of corruption and the way that authority is exercised and the role of hidden money and so on and so forth. So I don't have a lot of specific suggestions about how to go about doing that, but I really don't think it's too early to to kind of think big in terms of reimagining what the Ukrainian economy and the Ukrainian political system might look like, in the wake of this war.
Pavlo, could I add to that just two words? I completely agree. I think it's really important. I think to think about reconstruction now is important. What the worst thing in the world would be for the war to end and hundreds of billions of dollars start pouring into Ukraine, and that money is used in corrupt ways. And anytime you have massive influxes of financial aid coming into countries, the opportunities for that are are rampant. We know that from studying other countries for reconstruction. So I think it's really important to think about it. By the way, I think it's also important now to think about what money that have been seized of Russian assets should be used for that reconstruction. I would remind everybody that the Russian government has also seized Western assets. Everybody talks about that we've seized theirs. Well, they've seized ours, and there are companies that have lost their assets. There are planes that are leased to Russian airlines that have been seized. I think the legal argument is a strong one for why that money should be used for reconstruction. So that's another dimension that needs to be thought about right now. And then third, this is I think for many on this call, when it happens, I think it's vitally important that there is a non-governmental international consortium of some sort that is watching and recommending and pushing for transparency in the reconstruction efforts. I've always pushed these kinds of things in the past about other matters, but I think now it is vitally important. And I already know who should be the chairman of that organization. It should be Frank Fukuyama.
Frank, you accept that invitation?
Well, we'll see. We'll see if it's actually forthcoming. But yeah, I agree with Mike that you really do need, I think, a lot of international both advice, but also monitoring, to make sure that the process does occur transparently, and that the new Ukraine really is different from the old Ukraine.
Picking up on that, I know that Ukrainian Catholic University is already taking a lead in intellectual discussion how specifically new Ukraine should be different from the old Ukraine. It's a great opening for the School of Public Management, Valentina, I think. And it's also being picked up by different think tanks. For example, GlobeSec, which is the global think tank based in Central Europe. So we need to pool, the best resources, intellectual resources, into thinking, and then, as Professor Fukuyama would insist many times, not just thinking but also delivering the new Ukraine.
Pavlo, if I could say something. We would like to hear from the audience about Ukraine.
Sure.
The question shouldn't just be to us, but anybody that's got observations about what's going on now, Mike and I would love to hear them in the remaining time.
That was I was about to do. Eugene, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, dear Mr. Michael and Mr. Francis Fukuyama. My name is Eugene. I'm 18. I'm a student of Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, and also a freshman at political science faculty. And I want to ask about the foreign policy of the US towards Russia after the war, but I will begin with the prehistory. Some days ago, there was a professor in my university giving a speech, and he said that when the Soviets lost and the US won in the Cold War, there was a thought that Russia will take pro-European course, pro-European vector, and will be not a threat to European security and the security of the world. But and Putin in his first years seemed to be the president who could take this course and be not a threat to European security. But in the recent decades and in the recent years, I think it has become absolutely clear that after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, after the anti-West course of Russia, after the raping of our women in Bucha and other villages, and simply terrorist attacks towards the civilians, we understand that Russia do not want to take this course. It will not join this pro-European vector. So how should the U.S. foreign policy be built towards Russia after the war? Will U.S. government sanction them forever? Because like do it with Iraq, like they did it with Iraq or North Korea? What do you think?
Who wants to pick up on that?
I'll pick up quickly. I know we don't have much time. Eugene, great question. In the chat, I put a link to a book I wrote that talks about that entire history. By the way, it's in Ukrainian too, so I'll send that to somebody so you can circulate it. It's a long, complex history, which we shouldn't burn up our time right now to talk about, but it's a complex history. While Putin is in power, I do not foresee any kind of serious engagement with him from the Biden administration or from the United States of America. The one exception of that would be if Mr. Trump is reelected. Mr. Trump has been reluctant to criticize Mr. Putin or the war. It's kind of amazing to me, by the way, that he's been so stubborn in doing that. And he is a potential candidate. So that's the one scenario under which that would change. But I think as long as Putin is in power, Russia will be treated like a pariah state among the democracies. But I think it's also important to remember that a lot of the rest of the world is abstaining and not participating in one way or the other. The Chinese are not, the Indians are not, half of Africa is not, a lot of the Middle East is not. And so you will see that part of the world engaging with Putin more directly after the war is over. But I don't foresee a scenario in which the United States does as long as Putin is president.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let's do the following. We have basically 11 minutes left, which is totally not much time. You wanted to have more reflections from the audience. So I will just open up the floor. Miroslava, you go first, but then Vasil Zadvorny, please give both reflections and questions. And we, as the hands will be raised, I'll be inviting you, to speak. And then, professors, in the last 5 minutes, you basically pick up the questions or ideas that you want to reflect on, and that's how we will close. Miroslava, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Miroslava. I'm 19 years old, and I plan to study at Ukrainian Catholic University next year. And I have a question to Michael McFaul. So first of all, I want to quote your tweet, your recent tweet. You wrote that Margarita Simonyan, Russian propaganda specialist, she wrote her thoughts, not very pleasant thoughts, and you wrote that she speaks fluent English thanks to an American program that paid for her study in the US. So what do you think about that not all Russians debate? And what do you think about Russian students who are studying at the American universities such as Stanford and some other universities as well? So should they be denied route to study at the American universities if they do not show their point of view, if they do not protest against the Putin regime, if they do not show their disagreement openly? Should they be denied that rule or no? What do you think about that?
Okay, Ambassador, I go through other questions and then okay, good. I see that Taras Kushnir has his hand raised, but Vasil Zadvorny already announced you. Please go ahead.
Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, Mr. McFaul, Professor Fukuyama, for great discussions. Thank you for great support. It's really important for me to understand that Ukraine is really important part of the overall world discussion. And my question would be about the whole look on the political philosophy and the liberalism. So after the Russian-Ukrainian war, how would the perception of like authoritarian and autocratician regimes would be perceived in all over the globe. So we see the danger of such kind of political systems and their danger not only to their particular countries, but also to their overall global security. Do you think that the perception of the major like dangers in the world would change us, and this topic will be as important as, for example, climate change and the identity problem in the liberal philosophy or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Vasil Taras-Kushner, please.
Good day, everyone. I'm sorry I cannot turn on my camera. It's my pleasure to be here and to listen to both of lectures. And now my question briefly. We were talking about liberal democracy as our others, the legitimacy for power, both soft and hard power. So a state might use its power and it's using it under law, under the rule of law. Nowadays, the United States, as the main country where the liberal democracy succeeded, is demonstrating weakness, like no response to usage of chemical weapons in Syria, which is now putting our country to face the same trouble, or the withdrawal of United States army from Afghanistan, which put this state to the state of medieval country. So is there any fault of the United States as the global player, the global superpower state, which gave an opportunity for Russia to raise the challenge, to put an opportunity to take the opportunity to restore the multi-polar world? Thank you.
Thank you, Taras. I don't see other hands raised, so let's move into basically closing remarks. And Ambassador McFaul, you had a couple of questions addressed to you specifically. Let's start with you.
Okay, I'll leave the big questions about the future of liberalism to Frank, given that he's writing a book about it and thought about it. I'll say one word about Russian students and then my thoughts on that, and then hand it to Frank. And my proposal would be, let's just meet again sometime and continue this conversation. I think one other thing we should think about, Pavlo and others, Valentina, is maybe for students at Catholic University, why don't we arrange a special conversation with Stanford students? I think they would really benefit from hearing from your students some of these excellent questions. I know there's just giant demand here on our campus for conversations about Ukraine and learning more about Ukraine. And by the way, universities like Stanford need to capitalize upon that too, and develop our study of Ukraine and Ukrainian studies. And as one of our students said, to decolonize the study of Ukraine in my country, in the United States, so that it's not just a part of Russian studies as it oftentimes is. So I think that's another collective challenge we should take on. But two final thoughts. Miroslava, great question about Russian students. And this is a difficult question for me personally, as somebody who's lived in Russia a lot. Early in the war, I said there are no more innocent Russians, and that got me into a lot of trouble. I was criticized very militantly, mostly by American progressive political thinkers, including, one foreign policy advisor for Senator Sanders, and he said, "This sounds like this is what Bush said about terrorists and Al Qaeda," and so maybe that was the wrong language. But I do think, babushkas in Siberia that you're just listening to Putin and live in that bubble. Okay, I'll excuse them. But I'm not going to excuse Simonyan. I'm not going to excuse those people. I know all those people. I've known all those people for a long time. They know the stuff that they're saying is complete and utter nonsense on those TV shows. Slava Nikonov, who compared us to Satan versus not. complete hypocrisy, right? These are the same people that in the 90s were talking about democracy and asking people like me, by the way, when I would travel to Russia, to take them to very expensive restaurants in Moscow to be paid for by American taxpayers so that they could have lunch to talk about freedom and democracy. So they're complete hypocrites. And I think they need to be called out on that. With respect to students, and I would add to this, oligarchs and any Russians in the who want to be somehow rehabilitated in the West, I do think they need to speak openly. I do think that, especially those with means, billionaires, and so far very few have. Anatoly Chubais, I think, is the only one that's spoken out, and he's even been pretty quiet, right? Students, it's hard. I would just say it's easy for me to sit in Palo Alto and tell people with family in Russia what they should do. I want to be respectful that these are hard decisions for individuals. But I would say two things. One, so you know that of the Russians on campus here at Stanford, many of them have spoken out. They've appeared at demonstration organized by Ukrainian students. One of them just spoke at a teach-in we had that I organized and spoke very bravely about her arguments with her father in Perm. And I think that I really admire their bravery to stand with their Ukrainian colleagues, and we should encourage that. And then the second thing I would say is not everybody can be as brave as those young people that got arrested in Russia and facing 15 years in jail, but everybody can do something. Small acts of resistance, whether it's in Palo Alto or Moscow, to signal, even to a small circle that they're against the war. And I think that is a moment when there is good and evil, it's black and white, and there's no more neutrality. You can't pretend that there's neutrality in this war. And then on the liberalism question, I'll let Frank give a complete answer. But I think it just underscores what the question, I think it was Taras said, about why this fight right now is so important. I think it was President Zelensky said, I'm paraphrasing, right? Yeah, we need liberalism, but we need armed liberalism, or we need armed democracy. He said some phrase like that. By the way, he's great at those phrases, right? I need a ride. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. And I think that's right. I think, it's not just ideas that matter. It is power behind those ideas that matter. And at this moment, where the fight for liberalism and democracy is the largest conventional war in Europe, we have to back up our words with credible commitments. We're not going to intervene. President Biden's made that clear, but I think we've got to lean in to help Ukrainian small d Democrats and small l liberals to win the battle on the battlefield, and not just rhetorically. And I want to conclude by saying, Fukuyama was right in that piece that he wrote. He already is right. Ukraine has already won many of the major battles. Remember what Putin said. He said, Ukrainians are just Russians with an accent, right? They're not real people. They're just Russians, and they'll become normal. The propagandists, they all say that if Ukrainians would just become Russian, then everything would be fine. Well, he failed at that objective. He failed to occupy the whole country. He failed in the Battle of Kiev. He has no chance in hell that he will overtake all of Ukraine. And so I think those achievements, he did not denazify Ukraine, right? He did not destroy your military. I just think those are tremendous, tremendous achievements. This is a giant failure for Putin and his ultimate objectives. And at the same time, there is this new front line in the Battle of Donbass that I think will be extremely consequential for the future of Ukraine, for the future of democracy and liberalism. And that's why I wish and hope that your warriors prevail. And I hope that my government and other European governments will help Ukrainian warriors prevail.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Professor Fukuyama, since we are out of time, take as much time as you want to tell us about the future of liberalism.
Well, I'll be very brief. On the student question, I've written this book that is a defense of classical liberalism, and one of the central tenets of liberalism is the virtue of tolerance. And so I do not believe that we can sanction or mistreat any Russian studying in the United States simply for having the wrong opinions about Putin. That's not a liberal attitude, because we have to tolerate views that we dislike. You can argue with them, you can push back, but beyond that, I don't think that it's appropriate to take stricter measures. So I can't answer the bigger question about what's going to happen to liberal democracy after all of this is over. However, just point out there's another big autocratic failure going on right now, which is taking place in China. Xi Jinping, like Putin, has become obsessed with this zero COVID policy, which under current circumstances seems to me a completely insane policy. So they've locked down Shanghai, a city of 27 million people, because of a handful of COVID cases. And if you've watched on YouTube, Chinese citizens at their apartment windows screaming to be let out, this is, it's not a bloody failure the way Putin's war has been, but it's a big failure. And I think that there's a good reason why these autocratic governments are failing in this manner, because they vest power in a single individual. And if that individual is wrong or crazy or obsessed with something, it's going to lead to terrible results. And so I do think that these autocratic we've been preoccupied with the failures of liberal democracies in recent years, but the autocrats are piling up some pretty big failures themselves. And I hope that people will notice that and recognize that when an autocrat fails, it could be much more catastrophic than when a liberal democracy fails.
Thank you very much, Ambassador McFaul, Professor Fukuyama. Thank you, Stanford. Thank you, Director Valentina Zasatko and the whole team, School of Public Management at Ukrainian Catholic University. Thank you, the audience. Please read the professor's articles. I think the new one has just appeared. The new website has just appeared. They are very approachable, so you can basically ask your questions. I know you asked maybe 10 or 15 times more questions that we were able to entertain. But anyway, I know that professors are very active online and they have a very active debate there. So please communicate there. So thank you all and have a great evening, everybody. Thank you. Valentina?
Yes, thank you, Pavlo, for moderating this very interesting and important conversation. Dear professors, thank you for your willingness to share your time and expertise, and thank you for the idea to organize the meeting between Ukrainian Catholic University students and Stanford University students. Of course, we will put it into the practice, and we will come with this deal to you and to Sasha Jason. So thank you to everyone, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye. Let's do it again. Bye-bye.